Kia ora and welcome to No ME, the video podcast series where guest speakers talk about pressing issues surrounding myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome. Join researchers, clinicians and patient advocates as we take a deep dive into the most recent evidence-based information so that you too can know ME. In today's special episode, we will discuss ANZMES petition to Parliament to reclassify ME as a disability. We are joined now by special guests Dr. Neera Jain and Kate Waterworth to talk to us about reclassification and disability needs. An equity advocate, Dr. Neera Jain, was named Best Doctoral Report winner at the 2021 Association for Medical Education Europe Conference for her thesis, Negotiating the Capability Imperative, Enacting Disability Inclusion in Medical Education. She completed a postdoctoral research fellowship at the Centre for Health Education in the University of British Columbia's Faculty of Medicine in Vancouver, Canada in 2022. She was formerly the manager of Auckland Disability Law, and now Dr. Jain is a senior lecturer at the Centre of Medical and Health Science Education at the University of Auckland. Kate Waterworth is a senior lecturer teaching in the areas of disability studies and rehabilitation studies at AUT University. She has a background of working as a physiotherapist with disabled children and has taught in the undergraduate physiotherapy school for many years. Her interest in disability issues stem from her work experiences and living with a rare long-term health condition. She is at the tail end of the PhD, where she is exploring the different ways in which disability has been understood historically and hopes that this will open up new ideas and opportunities for disability to be thought of and acted upon differently. Kia ora and welcome, haere mai. Thank you both for being here today.
Kia ora, Fiona. Thank
you.
Kia
ora.
Thank you.
So ANZMES submitted a petition and written report to Parliament towards the end of last year, and it was transferred to the Health Committee for review. Now, last week on May 3rd, ANZMES was given the opportunity to deliver an oral submission to Parliament in support of this petition to reclassify ME as a disability. But first, I'd like to welcome Neera and Kate to talk a little bit about the landscape in which people with chronic illness find themselves, and that's the landscape that prompted ANZMES petition. So Kate, would you like to start with giving us an explanation of the different ways disability is understood and where these ideas or perceptions have come from historically and socially?
Sure. So as I guess your listeners, your members may have noticed, disability, there's a variety of ways that disability is understood in New Zealand and around the world. And those understandings shape people's access to services, also their experiences in their day-to-day life. So if we look back within English-speaking kind of histories, it looks like the word ability started to be used in English 3 or 4 centuries ago, and that was used in the way that people were able to be considered a person under the law. And then more probably importantly for how disability is understood now, the ability to take part in productive work, or what sort of in the early kind of capitalist kind of system. The word disability wasn't probably used very commonly until the late kind of 18th, kind of 19th kind of centuries, and started to merge with the ideas that we might currently hold around what kind of impairment is. So in the Old English, there's words that were used that I might call impairments, so around vision and so deaf, for example, blind, what I might call physical impairment or cripple. Those kind of ideas are really long-standing and come through kind of church records and early sort of legal records. But when we see capitalism emerge and we see industrialization and the growth of factories being workplaces and people being considered able to work, is where we start to see this kind of new idea of being able to work or disabled for work. and often early on was disabled from workplace injury. Then we sort of see the development of the early kind of medical and surgical kind of systems, and our forerunners of our formal kind of schooling kind of system. And particularly within our schooling systems, actually, we see people started to be classified as normal or as not normal. And that was probably around about a century ago. So when the children in particular started to be classified as not normal or not able to be participating in the school system, we see lots of relationship between those people and the early medical practitioners, and the processes that medicine was using around diagnosis and the formation of diagnosis and classification, categorization. We start one of the ideas that if we look back at medicine from quite an amplified kind of view, we can look at medicine considering some people or some conditions as being normal or typical, and there being a deficit involved in those that don't fit within that kind of framework. And when we look at these complex ideas that we have around disability today, we can see that early kind of framing still take place in the way disability is considered. In over the last 100 years, we saw quite significant changes in different ways in our society, but really importantly, we saw civil rights movements, and that then moved into specific disability rights movements. And within them, you could say that disability was considered a social issue in the way that that disablement was around the way our environments, including our attitudes, our legislation, our policy were structured. So rather than a person being disabled by their body condition experience, they were disabled by attitudes, access,
barriers,
exclusion, barriers.
Yeah, barriers to being in society, right?
Yeah.
So, Neera, how does this translate in the current context of Aotearoa and policies that are in place right now?
Sure. So I think, what Kate has outlined is really that disability is socially, historically, and politically determined. It's not a taken for granted category. And yet, while it's not something that we can immediately say what disability is, we know that how societies define disability have material consequences for people. So they can get access to services and supports or not, income support, school support, medical support, at-home support or not, based on where we draw these somewhat arbitrary lines to say where disability is and isn't. And I think here in Aotearoa, we have these legal definitions that are quite broad and inclusive. You look at the UNCRPD definition, the Human Rights Act definition, that is really in the spirit of being inclusive, of protecting the rights of people who might experience disablement, as Kate has so nicely put it, and who might encounter barriers in society. And those laws really ask Aotearoa to hold itself accountable, to ensure that people don't encounter barriers. And yet, kind of what your petition has highlighted, and what we can see kind of looking at how those definitions then filter into systems and things like the NASC, where needs assessments are done, who gets disability support or not, through income support schemes, who is eligible for living support benefits, et cetera. That depends on either the internal policies or individual decision makers, how they are activating that. And I think what your group has identified is ways in which those definitions have drawn a somewhat arbitrary line that keeps people with ME/CFS out of that definition of disability. And by classifying it or including it as a chronic illness, it puts the onus on DHBs, or what we used to think of as DHBs, rather than the disability support system, which means there's different tiers of access. If we think about ACC versus medical systems versus the disability support systems, we know that people get different kinds of things through each system. All under this, we can look at this broad, inclusive legal definition, and yet the way that services are enacted really differ where you are interpreted to be within those lines. So I think it's a really good example, from an intellectual place, a really painful example from a lived place of how these definitions really affect people's lives and determine people's lives.
Yeah, how they play out in reality. So last year, Kate, you spoke with the media about the petition, highlighting what you consider as significant inequities to access in healthcare for people with long-term conditions and disability. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
So I guess, as Neera has just mentioned, we can see and hear stories of inequity, personal stories, also communities. So and we can look at that in terms of people's experiences of health and their experiences of healthcare. So Māori, for example, and Pacifica populations, other migrant populations, significant differences across access to all of those systems and their experiences of health. If we look, Neera mentioned the ACC. If we think of somebody that might have two people, one person might have had a stroke when they were 25, one person might have had a head injury as a result of an accident when they were 25. They might present really similarly in terms of their functional shifts, their shifts in participation, their symptoms, but what they being categorized as somebody that has an injury that therefore has access to ACC systems of supports, that will look very different from the person that has had a stroke, that is navigating through the NASC system and the long-term condition / disability kind of system. And then when we look at someone that's not ACC funded, that is navigating the other systems, we think about somebody with a long-term condition. We have these, something that's considered personal health, and then something that's considered disability support system or disability kind of definition. You both might actually have a long-term condition that affects your function. However, I think in the situation of people of your membership, it's often can be a fluid condition, might be one day to the next or 1 month to the next. You have different experience of your symptoms. They're having different impact on your day-to-day life. And they're difficult to quantify in the same way that the system requires you to. And that means that different access to allowances, for example, different support navigating your vocation or your occupation, completely different access to rehabilitation, for example. So my colleagues that work in physiotherapy sort of outpatients or community outpatients, different groups of people can access those services at different times, and they exclude many people.
I think that's an important point to make about ME as well, as you mentioned, with the fluctuating symptoms. It's not a black and white condition. It's not simple. It is a very complex condition, and policies need to be black and white. They tend to be black and white, don't they? So, but unfortunately with ME, there's no one size fits all.
And I think this particular condition, like many conditions that are recognised more recently, aren't well supported by healthcare practice generally. I think I talked about the early history of medicine, and my colleagues in rehabilitation come from a focus on one body system usually, and we've divided the body up into parts, and that person's great at looking at hearts, and that person's great at looking at legs, integration and the seeing somebody as a whole, looking at symptoms that are not attributable to a particular body organ, so that are more complex and more non-specific, is difficult for individual health practitioners and difficult for our systems, which our specialist kind of systems come from that history of being set up to look at one body part or one symptom. You do see a wave of systems that then were built to look at children, for example, or older people. But we don't have, our system doesn't respond to complex, shifting, fluctuating conditions. So I mentioned in my bio, I have a long-term condition. It's called Addison's disease. And so I have a similar set of non-specific kind of condition symptoms that took years for a health practitioner to read as a whole packet, because one person looked at my skin and one person looked at my fatigue and one person looked at something else. And they, instead of being actually, I don't, this is beyond me, I need to get some help, they just kind of moved me on. So I think it was also that ability of, our health practitioners have a history of wanting to be experts or of positioning ourselves as experts. And it's difficult within that position to be actually, I'm still learning or I need some help.
Yes, and I find we have, we have segregated the body, for want of a better term, and it's all disconnected, whereas a holistic approach is actually what's needed for some of these complex conditions, because it affects so many bodily systems. And of course, as you've mentioned, it's not just ME. We have thousands of people now with long COVID or post-COVID conditions, which may, a certain percentage of them may turn into lifelong conditions. And given the disability definitions we sort of touched on, we haven't actually specifically given a definition, but they tend to talk about that there's a physical or cognitive impairment, don't they, that it's going to last, longer than 6 months. So these things ME fit into, long COVID potentially can fit into that. And so there is this difficulty accessing services. And Neera, you mentioned the material consequences to this. So in Aotearoa, there is no dedicated funding for ME in the health system. Do you think, Neera, that it's important for funding and policies and services to be developed for potentially what we're looking at least 40,000 Kiwis, if not more, with the prevalence of long COVID as well?
Yeah. And I think, you're right. We don't know yet what the future of long COVID is going to be. And I was recently at a lecture where an expert, a doctor from the US was talking about COVID and long COVID. And he pointed out that there was a history written recently of polio, and they talked about, I think it was 10 to 30 years that it took to really understand and identify post-polio syndrome. So we're only at the start of this, and we can imagine, I'm sure we all know people who are living long COVID. I know people here in New Zealand and overseas. And it's a really, really tricky thing and a moving target. I think when you talk about funding, it's important to think about this. There's no dedicated funding. And I think going back to what we were talking about with definitions is that these are political. They're argued on. People advocate, like your group is doing, to be included on the basis of your experiences. And these limitations, these somewhat arbitrary limitations, are really, we could argue they're about resource management. In a health system like and social, welfare system like New Zealand has, there is attention to how we guard and manage resources. And yet we have these high level commitments that we've made to support disabled people, to ensure that people have access to society, to ensure people live good lives. So I would say, I'm not sure what the right funding model is. That's not where my expertise is, but I would say certainly we're talking about inequities in access to systems. People, as we've highlighted, who have very similar experiences, one of whom might experience really good support and services and others who don't. And that's because of these arbitrary lines that we've drawn around definitions or underneath definitions of disability. So I would say working out how to find the resources, how to ensure people have access to the resources that they need to live good lives would be in line with the commitments we've already made to supporting people within New Zealand.
Absolutely. And with the formation of the new health system and the Ministry for Disabled People, now would be the time for these conversations to happen, and with the policymakers themselves, and for them to utilize the expertise that's out there and the learned and lived experience of people with ME and now post-COVID conditions to get it right.
Absolutely. And I would say, some of the impetus underneath or behind around Whaikaha was to help people not be slipping through cracks within these systems, and to improve equity and justice for disabled people. And I think this is a really good example of something that Whaikaha really ought to be interested in, and ought to, I would hope, get behind and understand how this is an example of inequity in the system.
And so have you both seen, we've touched on it a little bit about barriers, but what do you think is the biggest barriers for health equity at the moment?
Oh.
Complicated question, but what do you think, Kate?
There are so many barriers to health and to people's experiences of equitable health outcomes. In New Zealand, Māori experiences of health and health care is distinctly different from non-Māori, and that plays out in people's length of lives. For example, if you look at the intersection of your of that kind of experience with, for example, intellectual impairment, a really dramatic difference again in life kind of expectancy. So I would say that the glaring experience of being Māori, being Pacifica, being a migrant, and access to health is something that we need to pay significant attention to in New Zealand. And then the way that intersects with disablement or long-term health conditions. Yeah. There's so much,
I know. Yeah. And we know that for Māori and Pacifica, they're underdiagnosed with ME as well, because it's not just access to healthcare, but it's
there's generations of things behind that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Just to add to what Kate's saying, I think from my perspective, when I think about this, and I think this is what Kate's also illustrating, is that ableism, which we can think about as systems, processes, practices that create a hierarchy of bodies and minds. And we've just talked about all these different ways that ableism plays out. I argue in my work that it's really a foundational kind of process that's happening within medical education, both in terms of how doctors are trained, but we've also looked at how doctors learn about disability and how ableism, I would argue, impacts that. And we live in a society, I would say, I don't know any society that doesn't have shades of ableism kind of in modern times, overarching the way things operate. And ableism interacts, it intersects, interlocks, it works alongside other forces like racism and colonization and sexism, heterosexism. And so we can understand those forces working together to create those experiences that Kate described. We know there are people who are going to lose out most by this system, while others who might be getting more but still aren't doing well. And so I think folks who live in these kind of more ambiguous, seemingly ambiguous, at least through our current medical understandings, experiences that we might call disability or disablement, are also on these fringes of being legible as disabled people, and therefore having access to systems and services that are aimed at undoing ableism, and yet are informed by ableism.
Yeah, and I think the social model of disability is such an amazing model. It just frames it all so differently, that it is not the physical or cognitive intellectual impairment, but it's the barrier to inclusion and participation that is the disability. And I love that, because it's showing that ableism is needs to change that. There needs to be inclusion and equity for people to be able to participate in society. And the United Nations produced a report in September last year, and they did actually recommend that people with ME should have access to disability support system and be included in disability policies and programs. We know in New Zealand, ME is not considered a disability and included in the Enabled Good Lives initiative that's being rolled out throughout the country. And I would like to know why not. Because the quality of life of people with ME is not great when you compare it to other conditions. They have higher burden of disease. The fluctuating symptoms that occur can actually be more severe and more impactful on quality of life than conditions that people are more familiar with, such as multiple sclerosis, some of the cancers and things like that we obviously talk about a lot more and tend to have more access to resources and services and dedicated funding and that kind of thing. And I guess part of the issue there is historical with ME, because it was so complicated and complex, and they couldn't find a specific etiology for it because it had multiple triggers. And so that biomedical research is still happening now. We're still showing the physiological effects and getting more understanding about it. But the reason that one of the reasons that ANZMES believes that ME should be recognised as a disability is that it just gives validation and legitimizes ME as a valid physiological condition. And as such, then they would be afforded protection of their rights as a disabled person as well.
As I was listening there, Fiona, I was thinking of, I mentioned earlier the thinking about capitalism and the idea of people being productive. And I think one of the things that probably is often the experience for these quite complex conditions that involve fatigue, and shifts in people's ability and capacity for different types of work at different times, is the social position or the social attitude towards not being productive, and the stigma around that. And so I think one of the particular challenges around your particular member's condition is how your symptoms are read earlier on by health professionals that didn't have an emerging understanding of the condition itself, and what that meant for how people are read and treated, and what that means for access and research and things like that. So I think there's the validation of this being a particular biomedical condition. There's also the validation that it's and the challenging the idea that human beings need to be productive in a certain way, and that productivity needs to happen in a workplace type environment. That being a family member, being active in your community, is a good life. Yeah, so it challenges, I think, society's understanding of what a good life is, and that's one of the other things that's important to consider.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think I was thinking around, one of my colleagues works and critiques the vocational rehabilitation space, and what we can find in that kind of system in New Zealand is often the way that vocational rehabilitation is practiced has become tied to the funding mechanisms, which are around ACC dominantly. However, great vocational rehab would support people with these fluctuating conditions to be able to be occupied in a way that suits them in the times and spaces that suit them, and that they are able to come and go from that, and support systems can flex and flux along and be responsive to that particular person and their needs. However, you know, the broader system that we live in terms of our economy and such, it's also challenging to interact with, right? Unless you have a social position within your workplace that you're able to control and manage your income, that would be very different for people, that don't have that privilege, I guess. Yeah.
Mm. And I think that's important. I just, before Neera, I can see you would like to comment. I just wanted to say it's important to note that people with ME want to get back into the workforce. They want to get back into participating in family social events, just, you know, little things. You know, quite a high percentage of people with ME are housebound, some are bedbound, and you know, having support and resources and dedicated funding means that they can have that toolkit to help them improve that quality of life. Neera, you'd like to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with kind of what you've both said. And I just to add that I think what we're illustrating is that the way our current system operates relies on how this definition is interpreted. So I think your approach with advocating in this way operates in line with the way our systems operate now. And I think what Kate is saying and what you're saying, Fiona, around really what access to support could do to push back on ideas of what a quote unquote normal productive citizen is and what we value in society. I think it's really important that we think about this. I guess the other piece that I would say is that unfortunately, I think getting ME/CFS kind of understood within this definition of disability, kind of activated in that way, is unfortunately probably the first step. What we know, and I'm sure Kate has many experiences with this as well, is that even people who are clearly within the definitional space don't always get the kinds of supports that they need or ought to have access to. And I think what we've also highlighted is that the kind of complex, fluid, or shifting nature of ME/CFS will, I suspect, challenge the systems as they exist now. And what I think probably is down the line and will be a really good opportunity for the disability support systems is to need to think creatively about what these systems ought to look like and how they ought to support people to live good lives and reduce any kind of additional labor. As you've highlighted, that energy is something people with ME/CFS don't have to spare. And so systems that are laborious, difficult to navigate, will not work and will continually disadvantage people. So I think there's probably multiple steps for your group to be thinking about. I'm sure you're already thinking about it once you hopefully achieve what you're going for at this stage.
Great, thank you. Oh, it's been wonderful talking to both of you. Thank you very much, Dr. Neera Jain and Kate Waterworth. It's been thoroughly interesting and a descriptive discussion, I think. I wish we had more time. I'm sure we could talk for hours about this particular subject. But it's important, I think, for our community to know that there are people out there like yourselves who are passionate about disability recognition for people with ME. So thank you for your time today.
Kia ora, kia kaha, kia manu nui. Good luck to all of you. Take care.
Thank you.
You've been listening to or watching an episode of Know ME, a place for you to hear the most up-to-date evidence-based information on ME. Thank you for joining us.